It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Well, it's the political campaign trail that we're going to be talking about today, and we're going to be talking about a guy that's on it. That's a phrase that you hear a lot. He's on it in more ways than one. Chris McGreal is rejoining us here on Podcast by George. He's a friend. He's an awesome journalist. He's a book author. He's out of the BBC in London. Matter of fact, I want to read this bio. And then I got a quick question that came to mind when I saw this, Chris. It says, you were a foreign correspondent for The Guardian covering Africa, the Middle East, and Central America. You're now based primarily in the U.S. Of course, you won awards for the coverage of Africa, Israel, and the U.S. A former merchant seaman, I always liked that. He began his career in journalism in 1982 with the BBC local radio. And when we had him on before, he was talking about his new book, American Overdose, The Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts, published by Public Affairs in the U.S. and Guardian Faber in the U.K. So the question, Chris, is when you were with the BBC in 82, and you were starting out, it sounds like, did you know Philip Till?
I did not know.
Okay, he was with the BBC in the London Bureau, and I used to work with him. I was talking to him quite a bit back in the mid-'80s, and he was very helpful in my career. Matter of fact, he kind of set me up on a couple of the biggest stories that I was able to do that, weren't local, weren't in the foreign area. Just briefly, folks will like hearing this too, I think, on my podcast, but the American Embassy in Beirut was bombed, as you may remember, and we got the flash on the wire, and I called Phil at the bureau there in London and said, where are they going to take these folks when they bring them to the hospital? And he said, well, there's only one place to take them, or the place that they would is American University hospitals. And I said, okay, great. Hung up the phone. I called American University Hospitals. Now, this is radio, WHO, back in about when you were working the BBC there, and called the front desk at American University Hospitals. I said, hey, they blew up the embassy. They're going to be bringing people in there. And the guy said, yeah, I know it. They're coming in right now. And I said, they are? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, hand the phone to somebody. So he handed the phone to the first guy on a stretcher that came through the door, and it was the spokesman for the U.S. Embassy. And because it was on the phone, it was a live interview, the first live interview with a survivor of the U.S. Embassy bombing in Beirut. And then the other thing Phil set me up, helped me with, was an interview in the invasion of Grenada by the U.S. But we'll get to that. We're not here to talk about my long dead career. We're here to talk about yours. And you've been out filing a series of stories around the country, and particularly the Midwest and Iowa, as we have a run-up here to the Iowa caucuses and, of course, the 2020 election in November. And I want to preface this a little bit by telling folks, I'm recalling back in 2016 when we were listening and watching the pollsters, and they were telling us that Hillary Clinton was going to win hands down, and a lot of people were saying, don't pay attention to the people that are out covering these events because it's a small sample size, and they just see what they see, and they're just interviewing individuals, and what you got to pay attention to are these polls. Well, the polls were all wrong. And in the meantime, at least the early polls, they did change right at the last minute. But in the meantime, correspondents, reporters like yourself, Matt Taibbi with the Rolling Stone, Michael Moore in particular, they were saying, hey, Trump could win this thing. It's looking to me out here on the ground like Trump's got the advantage. And people were saying, that ain't going to happen. The polls say there are more Democrats in this country easily. The Republicans can't win with any candidate, and they're sure not going to win with this thing, according to the polls. Well, welcome to the real world, because as we know what happened next, we got Donald Trump, and we've still got him. So I don't know, Chris, it's a long run up there, but what are you seeing out on the ground? What are you finding out around the state of Iowa particularly?
Well, I mean, it's important to bear in mind, of course, that the Democrats, Hillary Clinton, did win the election and the popular vote. And, that's crucial, I think, in bearing in mind as we go into this election. When it came down to it, it really was fewer than 80,000 votes in 3 states that delivered Trump to the White House. And I think And I've been going to those states. I've been going to swing counties in those states, looking at counties that twice voted for Obama and then swung quite heavily to Trump in Iowa, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, places like that. And I think the president has a problem. Um, I look at the support he had in those counties that helped deliver him victory in those states, and those states helped deliver him to the White House. And what you see is that he's struggling to maintain that level of support. There's enough people who swung across that now doubt him. In fact, in northeastern Iowa, I spoke to a chair of the local Republican Party who's actually thinking of voting for Pete Buttigieg. And he said that on the record. Up in northern Wisconsin, I was meeting people who ran the local Republican Party, and the party split. The local chair, she's full on for Trump, but the deputy chair has quit and has now actually has made an ad in favor of the Democrats, an anti-Trump ad. She's walked away. So I think the president might be struggling to hold on to his level of support, obviously not amongst that hardcore that's going to forgive him everything and always vote for him. But there's enough people who are wavering. And that's an added problem for him, because it's also clear that, at least in a number of places, the Democrats are mobilizing people. I think young people, particularly in urban areas, over issues like climate change, actually are paying attention in this election. And I think that perhaps is a problem for the president. And I'm not saying there's not a path for him to win. I think there still is. I think, nonetheless, he faces some challenges.
Well, when I was a young man and you were a younger man, normally I would say, well, it's because of the current setting where you have the Democrats running around making their case, getting a lot of the news coverage, and as soon as the primaries get well in and the Democrats get their nominee and the Republicans start to state their case and the president starts to reinforce his position, then the balance will change a little bit. But Trump basically never stops campaigning. I mean, he's always rallying his cause. I mean, his story is being told and overtold, really, all the time. So maybe what you're seeing is more accurate and more important than ever with, like you say, that I think that's interesting up in northeast Iowa. Well, so my question then is, it's all about, as we started with the Electoral College and these red states, and it's all about what are called swing states in particular. Are you seeing some red states that are in this swing category that could maybe change where they went red in 2016?
Yeah, I think particularly Michigan and Wisconsin, very narrow margins of victory there. Then you've got Pennsylvania. In all three of those states, Trump won by less than 1% of the vote. In Michigan, it was by 10,704 votes. In Monroe County alone, which was a big swing county from Obama to Trump, he won by 16,000 votes. So that county alone delivered him the victory in Michigan. That's not a huge mountain for the Democrats to climb. Now, they've got challenges. I mean, the biggest asset in places like that for Trump right now is the economy. And you hear it constantly. The economy is doing well. Why will we take a chance on somebody else? I spoke to a big union guy, long-standing union member, pipe fitter there, who was one of those who voted twice for Obama and then went to Trump. And he'll be voting for Trump again because of the economy. And he said to me, people will theorize about what's right and wrong about the president, the policies, this, that, and the other. But when they get in the voting booth and they pull that curtain, they vote their pocketbook. And that's what I'll be doing. And I think there's definitely something to that. The problem, I think, perhaps for the president is, firstly, if, depending on who the Democratic candidate is, of course, but if you have a candidate who can mobilize people, excite people, get people out, then he needs to increase his vote to offset that Democratic increase. And it's not clear to me where that increased vote is coming. It's not clear to me that there's a whole lot of new people flocking to Trump because they've been enthused by him. In fact, like I say, you have this layer of doubters now. So I do think that's a problem for him. Similarly, in Wisconsin, the cities, if you look at the midterms in the cities, it's clear that in 2018, there was increased turnout for the Democrats. They took a lot of the state offices, including the governorship. And whilst I understand you can't, necessarily translate local and state elections to a national setting, nonetheless, I think it's an indicator there that this time Democrats are more energized, partly because so many of them are so angry with Trump. There's also that section. I was just at a Bernie Sanders rally here in Des Moines last night, and they made a point of asking, did you vote for Hillary Clinton? And a number of them who refused to vote for her will be voting for whoever this time. So, there's that lesson learned as well. And so I think that he's going to face, Trump is going to face a greater challenge this year in the Democrats. And I think that's a problem for him.
What you were hearing at the Bernie rally last night is extremely critical. There's several things that you said that I'd like to make a comment on, but one of them is, I went to, and you may have been there too, I went to Bernie's first rally in Des Moines when he first announced it. The first thing that he said, did you recall, the first statement that he made was that he would be supporting the nominee no matter who it was. Under any circumstance, he wanted to make sure that everybody knew that he was going to support the Democratic nominee. And I thought, man, that's kind of an odd way to start your first rally at your announcement, basically, was saying that you were going to support whoever the nominee was instead of just yourself or whatever. So, I mean, that I think that's really significant that he said that. Now, that said, and you mentioned these people that want to defeat Trump under any circumstance, there is a contingent because of how they feel they got cheated, lied to, and screwed in 2016, that are these Bernie and bust folks, that Bernie or bust, they will not vote for anyone but Bernie. Are you encountering any of that?
Less of it.
Yeah.
Yes, it's definitely there. And of course, this dispute with Elizabeth Warren about what was said in that room about can a woman be president has fueled some of that. There were people at the rally last night who, are very angry at Elizabeth Warren now, think that it's an attempt to stab Bernie Sanders in the back. And would they vote for her? When I asked, they were quite hesitant about who they would vote for if it wasn't for Sanders. But I think there's less of that. I came across more people who had reflected on what had happened and regretted not voting for Clinton. I also came across two women last night, and there's only two in a quite big crowd, but nonetheless, to stumble on them, who voted for Trump and who regretted it and who were at a Bernie rally. And both of them were undecided as things are, but they were definitely voting Democrat, and they were both leaning towards Bernie Sanders.
Well, yeah, I'm glad to hear that. I encourage folks to check out Chris's series that he's running here in The Guardian. I mean, it's great stuff. And I'm struck by one. I can't get this image out of my mind, Chris. I don't know. I would assume maybe that you take your own photographs, but you talked about how the economy is always a critical issue here for presidential politics. In fact, people will tell you that when the economy is this strong, the stock market is this high, an incumbent does not lose. I hope that's not true, but that's the circumstance that we find ourselves in. Okay, so you have this article where you're talking to this guy out in western Iowa, and he's talking about it's economics, it's the economy, it's the good economy that makes him want to support Trump's reelection. Well, I'm not to criticize the guy, but I mean, he's a lower income western Iowa resident standing there on his front porch. You would think the enthusiasm for the economy would come from stockholders, CEOs, shareholders. It would come from big business. They're booming, man. They're doing great. They got these tax benefits and incentives, and I mean, things couldn't be rosier for these folks. But again, I'm always struck by the irony, really, of your article. Were you meaning to be a little ironic there, or did it just come out that way?
No. Firstly, I should point out I don't take my own photos, and if you saw my own photos, you'd understand why. They send along a professional photographer who knows what they're doing. But no, I wasn't attempting to be ironic. I'm just attempting to reflect what people think. But I'm at least in one of the series, I made quite firmly the point that viewing the economy doing well isn't the same as feeling prosperous. And I think that is something that's changed since the Great Recession of a decade ago. Employment is a sign of the economy doing well in several places. And so in northeastern Iowa, for instance, actually, they need more people because there aren't enough workers for factories there. And this is partly why immigration is, of course, such a complex issue, because a lot of rural communities are actually taking in immigrants because they can't find enough people to work in various plants in those places. And so it's not that people feel particularly prosperous, it's that they feel secure in employment. Even if that employment's not particularly good, even if they have to work a second job, they have been able to find a job. And that matters a decade on from, unemployment and potentially losing their house. And then the other thing is, for those that have them, the 401ks, their retirement funds, they look good because the stock market's doing well. So they look at that and feel prosperous. But of course, as we know, that can go up, it can go down. But that is a mark. And Democrats find that quite frustrating. Several have said to me, activists, officials said, I wish that people wouldn't just look at the stock market and judge the economy on the stock market. They should look at their own personal circumstances a lot more. Well, they do. They say, I've got a job. I do think there's one economic issue, though, where the president's extremely vulnerable, which is healthcare, which is, of course, an economic issue because it's high cost. And when I talk to people out there about what is the main economic issue for you, it's the cost of healthcare. That comes up constantly. And how you deal with it comes up constantly. And he's very vulnerable on that because he came in promising, as you know, to make a change on that. And he hasn't done that. And worst of all, he doesn't appear to have a plan. And people are quite frustrated at that.
Myself included. And before we lose you today, I just want to emphasize what we talked about earlier. And you made an excellent point. It's not about this popular vote. It's all about the Electoral College. It's all about these red states. And Hillary Clinton was beaten convincingly by Trump on the Electoral College map. If the Democrats are going to win, they've got to flip some of these red states blue. And of course, our immediate experience here in Iowa. It's a red state. It was in 2016, but a lot of people believe that it could have been blue because Bernie Sanders, they think, should have been the nominee or should have been winning the Iowa caucuses. It was kind of some sleight of hand in the DNC that resulted in Bernie losing the Iowa caucuses. Wisconsin and Michigan, Bernie won. And maybe, like you say, those are the best opportunities for some flipping to blue. Flip maybe is not the best word, but these are folks that felt left behind, going clear back maybe to the era of Bill Clinton. Maybe that had something to do with why Hillary Clinton wasn't able to win those states. And they're not going to vote. I don't think they're gonna go for a Democrat if it's someone they view as a centrist, a moderate, somebody that's holding the old line, party line, and kind of just the same old crap, for lack of a better description. They're not going to get off the couch. They're not going to go to the polls and vote Democrat, because it isn't just the people that voted for Trump. It's the people that didn't vote, really, is the biggest problem in those areas. So who can motivate then? Who can get them to vote? Well, Bernie not only won Iowa, I think, technically, won Wisconsin, won Michigan. Is it, how important do you think it is that the Democrats nominate someone that's not a centrist, a DNC type person?
So this is the great divide inside the party, and you see it at a local level in these counties. So I was in Monroe County talking to the Democratic leadership there, and there's an older generation that were including a guy called Bill Lavoie, who used to be the state representative for the area around Monroe County, which is a deindustrialized county, lost its Ford factory a decade ago, a bit more, with 3,500 jobs with it, just south of Detroit. And all the Democrats have lost their seats from that area over that period of time. And he's of the opinion that they need Biden because they need to win back the Trump voters. A younger generation of activists inside that party, including a guy called Christopher Slatt, who's running now to try and win back Lavoie's state representative seat, says those voters are gone. They've gone to Trump. They're probably not coming back, but we certainly shouldn't be putting our efforts into trying to win them. What we need to do is turn out those people, like you say, who didn't come out last time, who didn't vote last time. And to do that, we need policies. We need something to motivate them. And that's the point that Bernie Sanders made at a rally last night. He raised, and interestingly, Elizabeth Warren in the past couple of days has raised it as well. So they obviously feel that this is now a crucial question, that settling for the safe pair of hands, for the continuity candidate, isn't going to win the election. That you've got to have a reason to go out and vote. Sanders said bluntly, the only way to beat Donald Trump is higher turnout. The only way to have higher turnout is policies that get people to the polls. And there's a very strong feeling that that's the answer. Personally, I think it's hard to call because I talk to a lot of people, and these margins are going to be quite fine. But I can see the merit of that argument when I talk to young people. They want action on things. They're not interested in just same old.
Well, personally, for me, the elephant in the room, and we talk about it all the time on my podcast, is climate crisis, because a lot of this is, in the political weeds, obviously, but I'm putting it to people. I don't know, from what I'm hearing, we may have 10 years, we might have 20 years, maybe no more than that, and then all of this stuff becomes gingerbread, basically. I'm kind of surprised and shocked that it isn't dominating the national conversation more than it is. Are you hearing any of that talk out on the trail about the climate crisis?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point. Yes, it comes up, but something I consistently heard from young people is they want it talked about more. And you're absolutely right. If I were to come up with a divide on this, I'd say older people want to talk more about healthcare. They want specifics on healthcare. They like the idea of Medicare for all to some degree or another, but they want numbers. They want to know what it's going to be on their taxes. So they want the detail. And that's because it impacts them. They've got families, you've got kids, as you know, you spend a lot of time going to the doctor, etc. So they feel that more acutely. Younger people, it's the climate crisis, absolutely. And they want it talked about more. It is talked about. I mean, both Sanders and Warren bring it up quite a lot. And John Delaney, I think, said it's his primary issue. But it's true that a lot of younger people want it foursquare, that everything should be built around this issue of the climate crisis. And I think that is undoubtedly an issue that will get them to the polls, and undoubtedly, a key issue in deciding who to vote for.
God, I hope so. Well, there he is, folks. I mean, he's great for coming back on the podcast. You'll hear me at times criticize the corporate media and some of the mainstream noise that we hear in this country, but this guy ain't one of them. Chris McGreal is a real journalist, man. He is working it. He's out. He's a tough son of a gun. Well, he's a former merchant seaman, so I guess maybe that's why. I don't know how you do it, Chris, but God, good on you. Stay on him. Give you the last word here. Anything that I should have asked about, or anything you want to say here as we close the podcast?
No, not really. The toughest thing about being out here is the weather.
I got it.
I'm not used to this cold. I moved here from South Africa. This is a different setup.
God. Well, that's great. That's Chris McGreal, folks. He's the foreign correspondent for The Guardian, which is funny because that's why he's here in the United States. He's a foreign correspondent based here in America, which makes him a friend of ours, and we're glad to have him on here. And of course, check out my other podcast about his book, or check out his book. It'd be the best way to get it on Amazon and all the other places you can buy books. The American Overdose, Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts. And that's Chris McGreal. Thanks again, pal. Good on you. Good luck. Travel safe. Travel well.
Thank you.
All right, Chris McGreal. That's another podcast. By George.